Iran has slammed the British Foreign Secretary's remarks that Tehran is responsible for an impasse in the ongoing JCPOA revival talks in Vienna. Foreign Ministry Spokesman has dismissed Liaz Truss's claims as irresponsible and baseless. Saeed Khatibzadeh further highlighted that it was Iran's strategic patience that sustained the talks so far. He called on other parties to drop the blame game and show some determination to come up with a good agreement at the table. Khatibzadeh underlined that the window for negotiations will not remain open forever. Liaz Truss on Tuesday claimed that Vienna negotiations are reaching a dangerous impasse and that Iran will be responsible for it. Joining us now from Bristol is Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, for more on the story. Hello, Tony. Pleasure to have you back on Press TV. Now, while Iran is being blamed for slowing down the talks, Tony, Iran has been complaining throughout the first, second, third, up to the 8th round of talks now that it is the only one putting forth practical solutions and initiatives to get this thing revived. It feels like the Europeans are just dragging their feet and waiting for what Washington has to say.
Yeah, or what Tel Aviv has to say. The problem here is that nobody in the world, apart from a tiny number of people in the deep state and the establishment media, believe anything that Liz Truss says about this. I mean, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, is possibly the most important, probably almost certainly the most important deal in the world. And when Donald Trump decided to tear it up, he created a massive problem. That's actually, going on till today. It's the most important relationship, I think, to keep going, which is the relationship between the West and the trust between the West and Iran, because Israel has been doing everything it can, pouring all sorts of American money at everybody that tries to get on well with the Iranians in these negotiations. And so for Liz Truss to say this, I mean, she really has lost contact with reality, blaming the Iranians for a deal which the Americans have pulled out of, and everybody else pretty much is trying to put back together again. And the Iranians have been incredibly patient. You're right. But let's have a look at Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary of Britain now. Who is she and where did she come from? Well, she only managed to make it into Parliament after a secret affair with a married man. And even though she had the cheek to replace another candidate for the Conservative Party who had been removed because they had a married affair. So, I think she's got into Parliament on the wrong foot there by deception and also by, cheating or helping a man cheat on his wife, and that's how she got into Parliament. In the first place, she's now replaced Dominic Raab because he was removed because he has a mind of his own. And he said back in June 2021 that the British destroyer sailing into Russian waters in the Crimea was a reckless thing to do, and therefore he wasn't lasting long in the Foreign Office. I would also reiterate that the British Foreign Office is not a thing on its own. There are, ever since the early 1900s, very powerful financial forces, such as the British Royal Institute for International Affairs at Chatham House, that spend vast amounts of money deciding what British foreign policy is going to be. And they are very, very active in trying to make sure they get their person in as a foreign secretary. So Raab was removed, she was put in, and also she was against Brexit as well. So she's basically a globalist. She's somebody that acts for other people. And she was very embarrassed the other day on the radio here in Britain when she didn't seem to understand the difference between an invasion and an incursion. And she's been ridiculed by the well-known commentator Piers Morgan here, saying she doesn't know anything about foreign policy, and yet she is our foreign secretary. So I wouldn't take what she's saying too seriously, even though the Western media seem to far too much.
So, Tony, basically, Donald Trump opted out of it back, in May 2018, I believe. Iran started in levels staging down its commitments. About a year later, I think it was late 2019, and still, then Joe Biden comes into office. Throughout that whole time, we didn't see the Europeans, even though they blasted the Trump administration for abandoning the JCPOA, they did nothing to preserve it, to allow Iran to get any of the benefits, and they actually helped Donald Trump with his crippling sanctions against the country instead. And now that Joe Biden, who also slammed Donald Trump's administration for opting out of that thing back in May of 2018, came into office, he let it sit on his desk for 7 or 8 months until he got around to it. Make a long story short, Europeans, while they're telling Iran that Iran is not playing fair, that Iran is being unreasonable, did nothing to preserve the JCPOA, and they're doing not too much, a heck of a much right now as far as getting it revived, are they?
No, and that's because they don't represent the 99.99% of the population who want peace. There is a tiny faction, a very powerful cult-like faction that want war. They actually want war because, number one, because they can make money from it, but number two, because there is this disaster capitalism faction out there that actually, for example, in places like Libya and Iraq, have made vast amounts of money from putting back together countries that have been blown to bits. And so there is a tiny fraction of the Western powers, really centered around the United States, Israel, and the Zionist factions in Britain, that actually are pushing this Israeli agenda war against Iran. And of course, the most dangerous thing about that is that the Israelis have nuclear weapons. And so if something like that was to happen, even though they seem to be pushing for it all the time, and conflict, and basically tearing up any kind of good friendship agreements, any normal trade relations, that's basically what they're trying to do now, is edge towards conflict. And they call it crisis initiation. Actually, there's a fantastic presentation that people can watch online by some Israeli professor, teacher guy, talking about crisis initiation. How do we get a crisis going? And of course, 99.99% of the world's population don't want these crises. They would much rather have prosperity and wealth shared out equally. I'm afraid there's a tiny, powerful faction based here in the West that doesn't want that at all.
All right, great stuff, Tony. Crisis initiation, I have to look into that. It's the first time I've heard that. Always appreciate you enlightening us there, Bud, from Bristol. That was Mr. Tony Gosling, their investigative journalist, joining us.